Hello everyone and welcome to my first devlog video for the game that I'm going to be creating called Jumper. Now Jumper is essentially a test project to start gaining some exposure to the ThreeJS JavaScript game development library, which is something that I really want to start trying to use and growing my experience in, primarily because I'm a JavaScript developer full-time. So the project itself is fairly simple. It takes a lot of inspiration from that really awesome 2007 Flash game called Avalanche. I don't know if you played it, but the idea is you're this little blob that's jumping up off of many other cubes and you're escaping this pool of lava which is growing beneath you, and it's like an endless runner style game but vertically, so you just jump as high as you can and see where you can get. I do want to test some things and evolve the idea, so I'm going to be merging it with other platformer style games where there's fighting and combat and cool sort of particle effects, and essentially just use Jumper as a playground to test new stuff in ThreeJS and see what I can build. Jumper itself is obviously the project I'm working on now, but I do have a much larger project in mind, and we're just going to use Jumper as this way to start building those skills till eventually we can move on to this other project and start getting into some really big implementations with ThreeJS. Finally, the purpose of these devlogs is to bring you guys on a journey with me so that you can grow and see how I evolve as a developer in this new world, and hopefully you guys will learn something, but also it gives me a brilliant resource that I can look back on in the future and see how I've progressed through the years and through different projects. So I hope you really enjoy the ride. Now, I'm not actually starting from ground zero. I've already worked on the project and have a very basic setup, but the inputs are all working and the game technically plays. It's just very bare bones at the minute. So in this devlog, I'll just go through the key milestones that I hit and just talk about each of the troubles that I had. I started by setting up a very basic scene entirely in ThreeJS, nothing else at this point. I've got a platform, my cube which will become the player cube, and added some basic orbital controls and a camera. Now the most difficult thing at this point, coming from engines like Unreal, is understanding how the different cameras work and the axes that you're operating within. And the orbital controls really give you a good understanding of where everything actually is in the world. So now that I had a basic scene in place, I could actually start moving the player cube and experimenting with how this moves. So I created a very basic implementation of the cube moving on the y-axis and seeming like it's falling. At this point there's no gravity, I'm just incrementing the y value, or rather decrementing the y value to make it look like it's falling. I then added a very basic implementation to stop the cube as it was falling through the platform. This was more or less checking for a collision between two objects on the tick function and then stopping it from decrementing its y-axis any further. Now that the cube was technically falling, I could play with the camera and adjust the camera's position in line with the cube's y-axis position as well, to make it look like the camera was falling along with the cube. This would become a pretty key component. Obviously, when we're jumping and making the cube ascend through the world, we're going to want the camera to actually follow the cube as well. I did encounter this weird zooming effect on the camera though, which was a side effect from having orbital controls enabled, which once removed looked like this. Now I actually had to start implementing physics, and that obviously broke everything. But I started with a library called Canon.js. There's a load of different JavaScript-based physics libraries out there, but Canon seemed to be the one that was the most well documented and easiest for me. The process itself was pretty simple. You'd set up your ThreeJS objects as normal, but then you'd create a physics object as well and map its position so that the physics object would always follow your ThreeJS objects. This was kind of tricky to get my head around because although there was a single object in the world, there was this hidden physics object operating behind the scenes that technically you couldn't actually see. So I found myself getting quite confused with where this object actually was in the world. After spending some time on that though, I had physics working and the object was falling due to gravity. I then made some minor changes to the camera so that we could see a bit more in the viewport and things were looking pretty good. Now that I had physics in place, I wanted to start playing with character movement, and the first place I thought to start was jumping, as the game is basically just jumping around. So I added some logic to apply an impulse to the physics cube so that it would propel the object into the air, acting like it was actually jumping. Doing this though led to some pretty interesting results. Now that I had physics working on the player cube in the form of jumping, I wanted to move on to horizontal movement. So I added an impulse to the cube, and obviously with it being a cube there was too much friction when you try to move it on a flat surface. So I replaced the cube with a ball, and that allowed the horizontal movement to work much better. Finally, I made some adjustments to the floor so that it would always follow the position of the ball, and then added a platform in so that you could see where the player cube or player ball was actually placed in the world now. Because with the floor moving, it was easy to seem like you weren't going anywhere. I did start to encounter some other issues though, such as the camera not pointing at the ball correctly, and some of the collisions on the platforms not aligning correctly either. I then swapped my focus over to the platform, as it was just a static object in the scene at the moment. I needed to add physics to the object so that it could fall, but then also fix the collision so that the player sphere would actually interact with it correctly. And as you can see, there was quite a few problems here when it came to fixing the right axes and making the cube actually behave. After some persuasion though, I had the platform falling and colliding with the player. Right now the platform is falling due to gravity though, which means that it's going to increase its velocity until it reaches terminal velocity, and that's not really the effect that we want platforms to have. Rather, we want the platforms to fall at a consistent speed and have that speed be adjustable per platform. I then spent quite a bit of time working out the best way to implement this. I tried everything from not using gravity to using different kinds of forces to counteract gravity, almost like an anti-gravity effect. But the one that worked the best for me was simply applying a linear dampening effect to the falling platform, which would essentially make it fall at a consistent speed instead. Skipping forward a little bit in time now because I lost some footage, but you can see that we've got the platform set up, all of the movement in the player, and I've also added some boundaries to the left and right of the viewport. This just makes it really easy to control where the objects fall, because the idea of the game is the blocks that are falling you'll be able to climb up, so ultimately you're going to want them to collect at the bottom. So having procedural generation to the left and right just doesn't make sense because you'd never get these blocks stacking. But it's all working, all the blocks are falling, and I'm creating multiple platform instances now. But this did introduce this new issue where you can see the field of view of the camera is causing the player sphere to actually distort and look strange. In addition to this, all of the platforms are obviously physics-based, so once they fall and collide with each other, you'll see that there's basically no friction and they're just sliding around the place, so this will also have to be sorted. But ultimately, it was really cool to see all these platform instances working and actually have somewhat of a playable version that I can jump around and start to test stuff properly. But more importantly, start fine-tuning the physics, because that's going to be the biggest challenge. Now that I was starting to fine-tune the physics, I quickly realised that having the player as a sphere was not the best idea, because obviously a ball is going to react differently to a cube when it comes to physics, and balls tend to roll around a lot more and have a much bigger effect. When I think about the player character, ultimately the collision of that character is probably going to be some kind of cube anyway. So I quickly changed the character's mesh to a cube and started playing with that instead. This would lead to fewer red herrings when it came to testing and playing with the physics. Finally, I adjusted the camera slightly and made all of the platforms have the same depth, and this is where I am today. That's it for the first devlog. I appreciate this was more of a recap and there was a lot of demo in this and not as much coding. but in future devlogs I want to make sure there's a lot more coding examples and a much more immersive experience. So I'll see you then.